Sarah Martinez stepped off the military transport helicopter onto the dusty ground of the NATO training facility in Romania. The rotor blades whipped her dark hair across her face as she grabbed her gear bag and moved away from the landing zone. At 28 years old, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a lean build that made her look more like a college student than a seasoned military operative. The other trainees were already gathered near the main briefing tent, and Sarah could feel their eyes on her as she approached. Most of them were men, tall and broad-shouldered, with the confident swagger that came from years of military service. They wore the uniforms of various NATO countries: American Marines, British SAS, German KSK, and Canadian JTF-2. Sarah wore simple woodland camouflage with no visible rank or unit insignia. "Great, they sent us a desk jockey," muttered Sergeant First Class Mike Reynolds, a towering Marine from Texas. His comment drew snickers from several nearby soldiers. This is supposed to be an elite joint operations course, not bring your daughter to work day. Sarah ignored the comment and found a spot near the back of the group. She had heard it all before. In her 12 years of military service, she had faced skepticism, harassment, and outright hostility from those who judged her based on appearance alone. What they didn't know was that Sarah had more combat experience than most of them combined. The briefing officer, Colonel James Harrison from the British Army, called for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Exercise Iron Eagle. Over the next 2 weeks, you will participate in the most challenging multinational training program NATO has to offer. You represent the best of your respective special operations units, and you're here to learn advanced tactics, share knowledge, and build international cooperation." Harrison's eyes swept across the assembled group. "This exercise will test every aspect of your training: combat skills, survival techniques, intelligence gathering, and teamwork under extreme pressure. Some of you may not complete the program. That's not a failure. It's a reality check." As the colonel continued his briefing, Sarah noticed the sideways glances and whispered comments from her fellow trainees. Lieutenant Hans Weber from the German KSK leaned over to his teammate. "What unit do you think she's from? Probably communications or intelligence analysis." Corporal James Mackenzie from the British SAS shook his head. "More likely she's here as an observer. Maybe writing a report on gender integration or something." The assumptions continued throughout the day as they were assigned to barracks and given their initial equipment check. Sarah bunked with 3 other soldiers in a small prefabricated building. Her roommates were polite but distant, clearly unsure what to make of her presence. That evening in the mess hall, the conversations grew louder and more pointed. Captain Antonio Silva from the Portuguese Special Operations Group decided to voice what many were thinking. "No offense, but I'm curious about the selection criteria for this exercise. I thought this was supposed to be for Tier 1 operators only." Sarah looked up from her meal tray. "What makes you think I'm not a Tier 1 operator?" The question hung in the air for a moment before Reynolds laughed. "Come on, sweetheart. Look around. Everyone here has been through hell to earn their spot. Rangers, SEALs, SAS, GIGN. What's your background?" "Supply chain management." Sarah's expression remained calm, but her dark eyes hardened slightly. "I've been in the military for 12 years. I've served in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and several places that don't officially exist on any mission reports." Weber raised an eyebrow. "Doing what exactly?" "Running logistics." Before Sarah could respond, Mackenzie jumped in. "Look, I'm sure you're good at whatever you do, but this exercise is designed for people who kick down doors and engage targets at close range. It's going to be physically and mentally brutal. Maybe you should consider if you're really prepared for what's coming." The mess hall had grown quiet, with other trainees listening to the conversation. Sarah stood up slowly, her meal barely touched. "I guess we'll find out tomorrow." As she walked away, Reynolds called after her. "Hey, no hard feelings. We're just looking out for team safety. Nothing personal." Sarah paused at the door, but didn't turn around. "Everything in the field is personal, Sergeant. Everything." Back in her bunk, Sarah lay awake listening to the sounds of the base settling in for the night. She thought about all the times she had faced similar skepticism, and how each time she had proven herself through actions rather than words. Tomorrow would be no different. What her fellow trainees didn't know was that Sarah Martinez had been recruited into a highly classified program while still in Army basic training. Her psychological profile had caught the attention of military intelligence recruiters who were looking for individuals with specific traits: high intelligence, emotional control under stress, and the ability to blend into any environment. For the past decade, Sarah had operated under various cover identities across the globe. She had infiltrated terrorist cells in the Middle East, gathered intelligence on arms dealers in Eastern Europe, and conducted solo missions that had prevented several major attacks on Western targets. Her official military record showed her as a signals intelligence analyst, but her real work was known only to a handful of people in the Pentagon. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same qualities that made her excellent at covert operations, her unassuming appearance and ability to be underestimated, were now working against her in this environment where reputation and physical intimidation often mattered more than actual capability. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah wondered how long it would take before her fellow trainees realized their mistake. In her experience, it usually didn't take very long. The alarm sounded at 0430 hours, piercing the pre-dawn darkness like a knife. Sarah was already awake, having learned long ago that being the first one ready often provided strategic advantages. She dressed quickly in her combat gear and was outside before most of the others had even gotten out of their bunks. The morning air was crisp and cold, with a layer of frost covering the ground. Instructor Sergeant Major Thompson, a weathered British veteran with 30 years of service, stood waiting in the assembly area with a clipboard and a stopwatch. "Today we start with a simple assessment," Thompson announced as the trainees gathered around him, some still rubbing sleep from their eyes. A 12-kilometer forced march with full gear, followed by an obstacle course, followed by a combat simulation. Nothing you haven't done before. Reynolds appeared beside Sarah, still adjusting his gear. "Hope you brought comfortable shoes," he whispered with a smirk. The march began at sunrise, winding through the Romanian countryside on rough terrain that included hills, streams, and dense forest sections. Each trainee carried a 40-pound pack, plus their weapon and water. The pace was aggressive from the start, designed to separate those who talked a good game from those who could perform under pressure. Sarah settled into a steady rhythm that she had perfected over years of operations. She controlled her breathing, maintained proper posture, and focused on efficiency of movement rather than speed. While some of the larger men powered ahead using brute force, Sarah used technique and endurance. By the 6-kilometer mark, the group had begun to spread out significantly. Several trainees were already showing signs of fatigue, their pace slowing and their form deteriorating. Weber, who had been near the front of the pack, was now breathing heavily and had developed a slight limp. Sarah, meanwhile, maintained her position in the middle of the group, seemingly unaffected by the grueling pace. She had learned in her covert training that drawing attention to yourself, either through exceptional performance or obvious struggle, was often counterproductive. Better to observe and assess while maintaining your capabilities in reserve. Mackenzie, running just ahead of her, kept glancing back with surprise. "You're keeping up better than I expected," he admitted during a brief water break. "Cardio was never my weak point," Sarah replied simply. Silva, who was struggling more than he wanted to admit, overheard the exchange. "The march is just the warm-up. Wait until we get to the real challenges." The obstacle course that followed the march was a brutal combination of physical and mental challenges. Rope climbs, wall scaling, tire flips, crawling under barbed wire through mud, and precision shooting while fatigued. The instructors had designed it to push even elite soldiers to their limits. Reynolds attacked the course with typical aggressive intensity, using his size and strength to power through the physical obstacles. He was impressive to watch, clearing walls with ease and carrying heavy objects that others struggled with. But by the time he reached the shooting portion, his hands were shaking from exhaustion, and his accuracy suffered. Weber approached each obstacle methodically, using good technique, but lacking the explosive power needed for optimal times. His military engineering background served him well on the technical challenges, but the pure physical demands were wearing him down. Sarah's approach was different from both men. She studied each obstacle briefly before attempting it, looking for the most efficient path rather than the most obvious one. On the rope climb, while others tried to muscle their way up using primarily arm strength, Sarah used a footlock technique that allowed her legs to do most of the work. On the wall scaling exercise, she found handholds and footholds that the larger men had missed. Her small size, which had been viewed as a disadvantage, actually proved beneficial on several obstacles. She could crawl under the barbed wire faster because she needed to get lower to the ground, and she could navigate tight spaces that forced the larger trainees to waste energy contorting their bodies. When they reached the shooting portion, Sarah's years of tactical training became apparent. While others struggled to control their breathing and steady their weapons after the physical exertion, Sarah's shots were consistently grouped in the center mass of the targets. Her heart rate had remained relatively stable throughout the course, allowing her to maintain the fine motor control needed for accurate shooting. Thompson watched the performance with interest, making notes on his clipboard. "Interesting technique," he commented as Sarah completed the course. "Where did you learn that rope climbing method?" "Trial and error," Sarah replied, not wanting to reveal that she had learned it during escape and evasion training at a facility that officially didn't exist. As the day progressed into the combat simulation phase, the skepticism from her fellow trainees began to shift toward grudging respect, though some held onto their preconceptions. The simulation involved teams of 4 soldiers working together to clear a mock terrorist compound using live ammunition and simulated casualties. Sarah found herself assigned to a team with Reynolds, McKenzie, and a quiet Canadian JDF-2 operator named Corporal David Chun. Reynolds automatically assumed command of the team, which Sarah had expected. "All right, here's how we're going to do this," Reynolds announced as they studied the compound layout. "Chun and I will take point and breach the main entrance. McKenzie, you cover our 6. Martinez, you stay back and provide overwatch. Call out if you see anything we miss." It was a classic move. Put the person you don't trust in a support role where they can't mess up the main operation. Sarah simply nodded her agreement. She had learned that sometimes the best way to prove yourself was to let others make their mistakes first. The simulation began with Reynolds and Chun approaching the compound with textbook military precision. Their entry was clean and professional, and they began clearing rooms systematically. McKenzie provided excellent rear security, watching for threats from behind. Sarah, positioned on a small hill overlooking the compound, used her scope to monitor the entire operation. Within minutes, she spotted something the entry team had missed: movement in a second-floor window that indicated a simulated sniper position. "Alpha Team, this is Overwatch," Sarah radioed calmly. "You have a hostile in the northwest second-floor window, armed with what appears to be a long rifle. He has a clear shot on your current position." Reynolds paused, looking up at the window Sarah had identified. "I don't see anything. Trust me, he's there. If you move 3 steps to your left, you'll be in his kill zone." Chun, who had been about to step into that exact position, froze. "I've got movement," he confirmed after a closer look. "Good eye, Overwatch." The team adjusted their approach based on Sarah's intelligence, and they successfully completed the simulation with no simulated casualties. As they regrouped afterward, Reynolds looked at Sarah with new respect. "That was solid work up there," he admitted. "You've got good eyes." "Thanks," Sarah replied. "It's all about knowing what to look for." Thompson approached the team during their debrief. "Effective teamwork," he noted. "Martinez, that was excellent threat identification. What's your background in reconnaissance?" Sarah hesitated for just a moment. "I've done some forward observation work." It wasn't technically a lie, but it didn't come close to describing her actual experience conducting solo surveillance operations in hostile territory. Her ability to spot threats came from years of staying alive in situations where missing a detail could mean death. That evening in the mess hall, The atmosphere around Sarah had changed noticeably. The open mockery had stopped, replaced by cautious curiosity. She was no longer the weak link they needed to worry about. She was an unknown quantity that had proven she could contribute to team success. But she could tell that many of them still saw her performance as luck or as limited to specific skills that wouldn't translate to other challenges. They had no idea that the first day had been Sarah operating at perhaps 20% of her actual capabilities. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah reflected on the familiar pattern. First came dismissal, then grudging acknowledgement, then eventual respect as her true abilities became apparent. She wondered what tomorrow would bring and how much more of her real skills she would need to reveal. The second week of training brought more complex challenges that pushed beyond basic physical fitness into advanced tactical operations. The instructors had designed scenarios that required not just individual excellence, but sophisticated teamwork and strategic thinking under extreme pressure. Sarah found herself increasingly integrated into the group dynamic, though some trainees remained skeptical of her abilities. The previous week had shown she could handle basic military tasks, but the upcoming challenges would test skills that typically took years to develop in elite units. The morning briefing was conducted by Commander Patricia Walsh, a Royal Navy officer who specialized in counterterrorism operations. Today's exercise is called Urban Nightmare, she announced, pointing to a detailed model of a city district that had been constructed on the training grounds. Intelligence indicates that a high-value target is being held in a hostile urban environment. Your mission is to extract the target while minimizing civilian casualties and avoiding international incidents. The scenario was more complex than anything they had faced so far. The mock city included multiple buildings, simulated civilians played by base personnel, and opposing forces equipped with advanced training ammunition that would simulate wounds and casualties if trainees were hit. You'll be working in teams of 8, Walsh continued. Each team will be given different intelligence, and will need to coordinate their approach. Communication between teams is limited, and you may encounter situations where your information conflicts with what others have been told. Sarah was assigned to Team Bravo, which included Reynolds, McKenzie, Weber, and for other operators she hadn't worked closely with before. As they gathered to review their mission parameters, Sarah noticed that Reynolds automatically assumed command again, but this time he asked for her input during the planning phase. Martinez, you've got good eyes for surveillance, he said, studying the aerial photos of their target building. What do you see? Sarah examined the intelligence packet carefully. The building layout suggests multiple entry points, but the roof access might be compromised. See these antenna arrays? They could be concealing defensive positions. The ground floor has too many windows facing the street, which means high exposure to counter-surveillance. She paused, studying the pattern of civilian movement around the building. Also, the timing of civilian traffic doesn't match a normal residential area. Too many people moving with purpose rather than randomly. Some of these civilians are probably opposition forces. Weber leaned over to look at what Sarah was pointing out. How can you tell the difference? Body language and movement patterns, Sarah explained. Real civilians in a conflict zone move differently than soldiers trying to blend in. They're more hesitant, they stay closer to cover, and they don't maintain tactical spacing unconsciously. Mackenzie was impressed despite himself. That's pretty sophisticated analysis. Where did you learn to read human behavior like that? Sarah chose her words carefully. Intelligence work requires understanding how people behave under stress. What she didn't say was that her ability to read human behavior had been honed through years of operating in deep cover, where misread of someone's intentions could expose her mission and cost lives. She had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect threats and identify hostile actors in civilian populations. The team spent another hour planning their approach. Sarah's insights had shifted their strategy from a direct assault to a more nuanced operation that took advantage of the opposition's weaknesses. Instead of going through the obvious entry points, they would create a diversion while a smaller element infiltrated from an unexpected direction. When the exercise began, Team Bravo moved through the mock city with practiced efficiency. Sarah took point for the reconnaissance phase, using her small stature and civilian appearance to blend in with the simulated population while gathering real-time intelligence on opposition positions. Wearing a simple jacket over her tactical gear, Sarah moved through the streets like a local resident. She identified 6 hidden sniper positions that weren't in the original intelligence briefing, discovered that the civilian vendors near the target building were actually opposition spotters, and found a service tunnel that provided access to the building's basement. Her radio crackled softly. "Overwatch, this is Bravo Leader. What's your status?" "Multiple positions identified," Sarah whispered, taking cover behind a parked vehicle. "Opposition strength is higher than briefed. Estimate 12 to 15 hostiles, not the 8 we were told to expect. They've got overlapping fields of fire covering all the obvious approaches. Can you identify the HVD location?" Sarah studied the building through her scope. "3rd floor, northeast corner room. I can see movement through the windows, but can't confirm target identity from this angle. There's definitely someone being held there. The opposition is maintaining a 2-man guard rotation." "Outstanding work. What's your recommendation for approach?" This was the moment Sarah had been waiting for. "The service tunnel I mentioned provides access to the basement. From there, we can work our way up through the building while the opposition is focused on external threats. But we'll need a significant diversion to draw their attention." Reynolds made the call to execute Sarah's plan. Team Alpha, working in coordination, would create a noisy demonstration at the main entrance while Team Bravo infiltrated through the tunnel. It was risky, requiring precise timing and coordination, but it offered the best chance of success. Sarah led the infiltration team through the tunnel system, navigating by memory and instinct through a maze of pipes and concrete. Her claustrophobia training from escape and evasion school served her well as she squeezed through spaces that would have challenged larger operators. "How did you know this tunnel would be here?" whispered Chun, who had been assigned to the infiltration team. "Most urban buildings constructed in this style have service access," Sarah replied, though the real answer was that she had infiltrated similar structures in real operations and knew what to look for. They emerged in the building's basement just as Team Alpha began their diversion. The sound of simulated gunfire and explosions echoed through the building as the opposition forces redirected their attention to the perceived main threat. Sarah led the team up through the building, using hand signals to coordinate their movement. Her knowledge of urban combat tactics, gained through actual experience in hostile cities across the Middle East and Eastern Europe, allowed her to anticipate how the opposition would position themselves and respond to threats. At the 3rd floor, they encountered their first real resistance. 2 opposition soldiers were guarding the hallway leading to the HVT's location. Sarah signaled for the team to hold position while she assessed the situation. The guards were alert, but focused on the stairs, expecting threats to come from below. Sarah spotted a maintenance closet that would allow her to flank their position. She moved with silent precision that amazed her teammates, using skills that came from years of close-quarters infiltration work. Within minutes, both guards had been neutralized with simulated kills, and the team was in position to extract the target. The entire operation had taken less than 20 minutes and had been executed without a single casualty to Team Bravo. As they secured the HVT and prepared for extraction, Reynolds shook his head in amazement. "Martinez, that was some of the best tactical work I've ever seen. Where the hell did you learn to move like that?" Sarah was sparing with details. "Special training programs. Different schools teach different techniques." But Mackenzie was studying her with new interest. Those weren't standard military techniques. Some of that movement looked like specialized infiltration training. "What unit did you say you were from?" Before Sarah could answer, the exercise concluded and the teams were called back for debriefing. Commander Walsh reviewed each team's performance, noting successes and areas for improvement. Team Bravo executed what I would consider a textbook infiltration operation, Walsh announced. Their intelligence gathering, tactical planning, and execution were exceptional. Particularly noteworthy was their ability to adapt to changing conditions and exploit weaknesses in the opposition's defensive posture. After the formal debriefing, several of the instructors approached Sarah privately. Thompson, the British sergeant major, was direct in his questioning. "Martinez, your performance has been consistently above expectations. Your tactical knowledge and execution suggest training beyond what's typical for most special operations units. I'm curious about your actual background." Sarah maintained her cover. "I've been fortunate to attend some advanced courses during my career. Good instructors, intensive training." Thompson studied her for a long moment. "Indeed. Well, whatever training you've received, it's been excellent. You're setting quite an example for the others." That evening, the atmosphere in the mess hall was completely different from the first week. Sarah found herself at the center of conversations rather than on the periphery. The skepticism had been replaced by professional respect and curiosity. But she could tell that some of the more experienced operators were beginning to suspect that there was more to her background than she was revealing. Her level of tactical sophistication, combined with her obvious intelligence training, was creating questions that her cover story couldn't fully answer. Reynolds approached her table during dinner. "Mind if I ask you something straight up?" Sarah nodded, though she tensed slightly. "You're not just an intelligence analyst, are you? Nobody learns to move like that from reading reports and attending briefings. You got field experience and not just the usual deployment rotations." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I've had some interesting assignments over the years." "I'll bet you have," Reynolds said with a knowing smile. "Well, whatever you really do, I'm glad you're on our side." As the conversation continued around the table, Sarah realized that her careful balancing act was becoming more difficult to maintain. Her abilities were becoming too obvious to hide, and the questions were getting more pointed. She wondered how long she could maintain her cover before someone with the right connections started making phone calls to find out who she really was. The final week of exercise Iron Eagle brought the most challenging scenario yet designed by NATO trainers. Commander Walsh stood before the assembled group with a gravity that hadn't been present in previous briefings. Behind her, a large screen displayed satellite imagery of what appeared to be a real military installation. "Ladies and gentlemen, today's exercise is classified at a higher level than anything you've participated in during this training," Walsh announced. "You'll be conducting a simulated counterterrorism operation based on actual intelligence from an active threat scenario." The trainees exchanged glances. Real-world intelligence meant this wasn't just training anymore. They were potentially rehearsing for an actual mission. 48 hours ago, intelligence services identified a cell of highly trained operatives who have taken control of a decommissioned military facility approximately 60 kilometers from this location. The facility contains materials that could be used to create weapons of mass destruction. Your mission is to neutralize the threat and secure the materials. Walsh's expression was grim. This scenario is based on real tactical challenges our forces face in the field. The opposition has been trained to NATO standards and will use advanced tactics, electronic warfare, and psychological operations against you. Sarah felt a familiar tension in her stomach. Real-world threats meant real-world stakes, even in a training environment. She had participated in similar exercises that later turned out to be rehearsals for actual operations. The teams were reorganized for this final challenge. Instead of the smaller units they had worked with previously, they would operate as a single cohesive force with specialized roles. Sarah found herself assigned to the Advanced Reconnaissance Team, working directly with two operators she hadn't worked closely with before, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Stone from the U.S. Navy SEALs and Major Elena Petrov from Russian Spetsnaz. Stone was a 20-year veteran with multiple combat deployments and a reputation for getting impossible jobs done. His presence at the exercise had surprised everyone, as officers of his rank typically didn't participate in training programs. Petrov was equally impressive, with expertise in electronic warfare and counterintelligence that made her invaluable for complex operations. Martinez, Stone said during the planning session, I've been watching your work throughout this exercise. Your tactical instincts and intelligence analysis have been consistently excellent. For this mission, I want you to take point on the initial reconnaissance. It was an unprecedented level of responsibility. Stone was essentially placing the success of the entire operation in the hands of someone he had known for less than 2 weeks. Sarah realized that her performance had convinced even the most elite operators present that she could be trusted with critical tasks. The target facility was a former Soviet-era research installation that had been abandoned since the 1990s. Recent intelligence suggested it had been reactivated by unknown actors who had sophisticated resources and training. The layout was complex, with underground sections, multiple buildings, and extensive security measures that had been updated with modern technology. Sarah spent hours studying every detail of the intelligence package. Satellite photos, floor plans, communication intercepts, and behavioral analysis of the suspected operatives. What she saw worried her more than she let on. The tactical setup is too sophisticated for typical terrorist operations, she told Stone during their private briefing. Look at the positioning of their security elements. They're using military doctrine that suggests professional training. And the electronic countermeasures they've deployed are beyond what most insurgent groups can access. Stone nodded grimly. That matches what our intelligence analysts suspect. We may be dealing with state-sponsored actors rather than independent terrorists. Petrov leaned over the planning table. The communication patterns also suggest coordination with external command structures. This isn't an isolated cell. They're part of a larger network. As Sarah continued her analysis, she began to recognize patterns that triggered memories from her classified operations. The tactical setup was similar to installations she had infiltrated in Syria and Eastern Europe. Too similar to be coincidental. I think I know who we're dealing with, Sarah said quietly. The operational pattern matches a group I've encountered before. Stone and Petrov exchanged glances. Where exactly have you encountered this pattern? Stone asked. Sarah realized she had said too much. Intelligence briefings from previous deployments. These tactics have been used in other theaters. But Stone was studying her with new intensity. Martinez, what's your clearance level? That's classified, Sarah replied, using the standard response that neither confirmed nor denied sensitive information. Petrov smiled knowingly. Interesting answer. Most soldiers would just tell us their clearance level. The reconnaissance mission launched at 300 hours under cover of darkness. Sarah moved through the terrain surrounding the target facility with skills that amazed even Stone and Petrov. She navigated by memory rather than GPS, used natural concealment that veteran special operators had missed, and identified security measures that weren't visible to standard surveillance equipment. How did you spot that motion sensor? Petrov whispered as Sarah led them around a concealed detection device. The vegetation pattern is wrong, Sarah replied. When you install electronic surveillance, you disturb the natural growth patterns. Most people don't notice because they're looking for the device itself rather than how the environment has been changed. It was a skill she had learned during escape and evasion training at a facility that officially didn't exist, refined through years of operating in hostile territory where detection meant capture or death. As they approached the perimeter of the facility, Sarah's analysis proved accurate. The opposition forces were using professional military tactics that went far beyond typical terrorist capabilities. They had established overlapping fields of fire, sophisticated communication networks, and countermeasures that indicated access to military-grade intelligence. This isn't a training exercise, Sarah whispered into her radio. These are real operatives using live ammunition. Stone's voice came back tense. Confirm your assessment. The defensive positions are too elaborate for a simulation. The electronic signatures match real military equipment. And I can see live explosives attached to the building entrances. There was a long pause before Stone responded. Mission parameters unchanged. Proceed with reconnaissance. Sarah realized that the exercise had been a cover story. They weren't training for a hypothetical scenario. They were conducting actual reconnaissance for a real operation. The NATO training program had been used as cover to deploy elite operators for an active mission. Working with skills honed through years of solo infiltration operations, Sarah penetrated the facility's outer security perimeter and began gathering detailed intelligence on the opposition's strength and positioning. What she found confirmed her worst fears. "I count approximately 30 hostiles, not the 15 we were briefed to expect," she reported. "They have military-grade weapons, night vision equipment, and what appears to be chemical detection gear. The materials they're guarding are definitely weapons-grade." Stone's voice was grim. "Can you identify the specific threat?" Sarah used her scope to examine the containers visible through the facility's windows. The markings and handling procedures told her everything she needed to know. "Chemical weapons," she confirmed, "appears to be nerve agents based on the containment protocols they're using. This is a legitimate WMD threat." As she continued her surveillance, Sarah spotted something that made her blood run cold. Among the opposition forces, she recognized a face from her classified operations. Viktor Kozlov, a former Spetsnaz operator who had become a key figure in international arms trafficking. "We have a problem," she radioed. "One of the opposition leaders is a known international arms dealer with connections to state-sponsored terrorism. This operation is bigger than we've been briefed." Petrov's voice came through the radio with surprise. "How do you know Kozlov?" Sarah realized she had made another slip. "Intelligence files," she said, but she could hear the skepticism in the silence that followed. The reconnaissance mission continued for another 2 hours, with Sarah gathering detailed intelligence that would be crucial for the assault team's success. Her ability to remain undetected while operating within meters of professional security forces demonstrated skills that went far beyond standard military training. When they finally withdrew to the rally point, Stone confronted Sarah directly. "Martinez, your performance tonight was exceptional, but it's raised serious questions about your background. Some of the skills you've demonstrated are taught only in very specific programs." Sarah maintained her cover. "I've been fortunate to receive excellent training." "That's not good enough anymore," Stone said firmly. "Tomorrow we assault that facility with real bullets flying and real chemical weapons at stake. I need to know exactly who I'm working with." Petrov nodded her agreement. "Your recognition of Kozlov and your knowledge of his operations suggests access to intelligence that most soldiers never see. Plus, your infiltration skills are at a level that takes years to develop." Sarah found herself at a crossroads. She could continue her cover story, but it was becoming increasingly implausible. Or she could reveal enough of the truth to maintain the trust of operators whose lives might depend on her skills. "I can't discuss the specifics of my background," she said finally, "but I can tell you that everything I've shown you represents my actual capabilities. If you trust my performance, that should be enough." Stone studied her for a long moment. "Performance doesn't lie. But if this mission goes bad, there are going to be questions that require real answers." As they prepared for the assault phase of the operation, Sarah knew that her careful balance of concealment and demonstration was about to collapse entirely. In less than 24 hours, she would either complete the mission successfully and face intensive debriefing, or the operation would go wrong, and her real identity would become a matter of survival rather than secrecy. The assault on the facility was scheduled for dawn, with teams positioned around the perimeter in coordinated positions. Sarah found herself assigned to the primary breach team alongside Stone, Reynolds, and 4 other elite operators. The weight of the real mission had transformed the atmosphere from training exercise to life-or-death operation. At 0547 hours, the operation began with a precision that reflected the skills of NATO's finest special operations personnel. Sarah's reconnaissance had provided the tactical intelligence needed for the teams to avoid the most dangerous defensive positions, but the opposition proved to be every bit as professional as she had warned. The first indication that something was wrong came when the communication systems were jammed by sophisticated electronic warfare equipment. Stone's voice crackled through static on the radio. "All teams were experiencing coordinated jamming. Switch to backup frequencies and maintain mission focus." Sarah moved with the breach team toward the main facility building, her weapon ready and her senses heightened by the adrenaline of actual combat. The opposition had prepared for a coordinated assault and were responding with tactics that confirmed her assessment. These were military professionals, not typical terrorists. As they approached the building entrance, automatic weapons fire erupted from concealed positions. The opposition had established killing fields that channeled the assault teams into predetermined zones. 2 operators from Team Alpha were hit in the opening seconds, their body armor stopping the rounds but leaving them wounded and unable to continue. This was a trap, Sarah realized, speaking into her radio. They knew we were coming. Stone's voice was grim through the static. Mission continues. We can't leave those chemical weapons in hostile hands. Sarah's mind raced through the tactical situation. The opposition's defensive setup was too perfect, their response too coordinated. Someone had provided them with intelligence about the assault plan, which meant there was either a leak in NATO intelligence or this had been an elaborate deception from the beginning. Using skills developed through years of operating alone in hostile territory, Sarah began moving independently of her assigned team. She had spotted a weakness in the opposition's defensive plan, a service entrance that wasn't being actively monitored because it appeared to be sealed. "Where's Martinez going?" Reynolds called out as Sarah disappeared from the main assault line. "Let her work," Stone replied, having learned to trust Sarah's tactical instincts. "She's proven she knows what she's doing." Sarah approached the service entrance using concealment techniques that made her nearly invisible to the opposition forces. Her small stature allowed her to move through spaces that would have exposed larger operators, and her understanding of how professional soldiers position themselves let her avoid their lines of sight. The service entrance was secured with an electronic lock that would have stopped most intruders. But Sarah's training in technical infiltration, learned during her classified preparation for deep cover operations, included techniques for bypassing sophisticated security systems. Within minutes, she had gained access to the building and was moving through the interior corridors toward the area where the chemical weapons were being stored. Her objective wasn't to engage the opposition directly. It was to secure the weapons and prevent their use while the assault teams dealt with the armed resistance. Moving through the building required every skill she had developed over 12 years of covert operations. She avoided motion sensors using timing and positioning that most soldiers never learned, bypassed security cameras by understanding their coverage patterns, and moved with silence that came from operating in environments where a single sound could compromise an entire mission. The chemical weapons storage area was guarded by 2 opposition soldiers who were focused on the sounds of battle coming from outside the building. Sarah observed them for several minutes, noting their patrol pattern and equipment. They were alert and professional, but they weren't expecting threats from inside the building. Sarah's approach was swift and silent. Using hand-to-hand combat techniques that went far beyond standard military training, she neutralized both guards within seconds. Her movements were economical and precise, designed to incapacitate rather than kill, but with effectiveness that demonstrated years of specialized practice. The chemical weapons themselves were contained in military-grade storage units that required specific procedures to safely secure. Sarah's knowledge of chemical weapons handling protocols, gained through briefings that most soldiers never received, allowed her to begin the neutralization process. "Base, this is Apex," Sarah spoke into her radio, using a call sign that she hadn't used in over 3 years. "I have secured the primary objective. Chemical weapons are contained, and neutralization is in progress." There was a long pause before Stone's voice came back, filled with surprise. "Did you just use the call sign, Apex?" Sarah realized what she had done. In the stress of the operation, she had reverted to her operational call sign from her classified missions. The call sign that was known only to a handful of people in military intelligence and Special Operations Command. "Confirm your identity," came a new voice on the radio. Commander Walsh, speaking with authority that suggested she had been monitoring the operation from a command center. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then made the decision that she had been avoiding for 2 weeks. "This is Agent Sarah Martinez. Call sign Apex," JSOC Special Activities Division. I am a deep cover operative conducting field assessment of NATO Special Operations capabilities. The admission sent shockwaves through the operation. Apex was a legend in special operations circles, a ghost operative who had conducted solo missions that others believed impossible. Stories of Apex's operations were told in hushed conversations among elite soldiers, but most believed the operative was either fictional or long since retired. Stone's voice came through the radio with amazement. Apex is supposed to be a myth. The mythology is useful for operational security, Sarah replied as she completed the chemical weapons neutralization procedures. Most of my missions require that people don't know I exist. Walsh's voice was authoritative. Apex, what is your assessment of the current tactical situation? Sarah's response was immediate and comprehensive. The opposition knew we were coming, which indicates either compromised intelligence or this was designed as a field test. The chemical weapons were real, but contained with safeguards that prevented actual catastrophic release. The opposition forces were professional, but their resistance was measured. They could have inflicted much heavier casualties if that had been their objective. As the battle outside began to wind down, Sarah emerged from the building to find the other operators staring at her with expressions of shock and awe. The skeptical comments and casual dismissal of 2 weeks ago seemed like ancient history. Reynolds was shaking his head in disbelief. The whole time we were giving you grief about proving yourself, you could have taken out this entire facility single-handedly. That wasn't the point, Sarah replied. I was here to evaluate NATO special operations training and capabilities. The mockery and skepticism are actually valuable data about how elite units integrate unknown personnel. Petrov approached with professional respect. The stories about Apex operations in Syria and Eastern Europe, those were all you? Sarah nodded. Among others. My job requires that most people believe I'm either fictional or someone else entirely. Mackenzie was studying her with new understanding. The movement techniques, the surveillance skills, the tactical analysis, everything makes sense now. You weren't learning during this exercise, you were teaching. Stone gathered the group for a final debrief. Martinez, Apex, your performance during this operation was exceptional, but it raises questions about why you were really here. Sarah's explanation was straightforward. Military leadership wanted an independent assessment of NATO special operations capabilities from someone with extensive field experience. The cover story allowed me to observe your actual performance under stress rather than the polished demonstrations that visiting evaluators usually see. And your assessment? Walsh asked through the radio. Sarah looked around at the assembled operators, soldiers who had gone from mockery to respect based on demonstrated performance rather than reputation or rank. NATO special operations personnel are among the finest military assets in the world. Their adaptability, professional competence, and ability to integrate unknown elements into effective teams under stress is exceptional. She paused, thinking about the journey from skepticism to acceptance that had played out over 2 weeks. My only recommendation would be that selection criteria focus more on demonstrated capability and less on preconceived notions about what elite operators should look like. As the teams prepared for extraction, Reynolds approached Sarah one final time. I owe you an apology for that first day. The comment about desk jockeys and bringing daughters to work, that was completely out of line. Sarah smiled, the first completely relaxed expression she had worn since arriving at the NATO facility. Actually, those reactions were exactly what I needed to see. How elite units handle integration challenges is crucial intelligence for future operations. So, the whole time we were underestimating you. You were providing me with exactly the data I was sent to collect, Sarah confirmed. Although I have to admit, proving myself to you and the others became personally important along the way. As the helicopters arrived to extract the teams, Sarah reflected on the mission. She had successfully gathered the intelligence needed for her report, helped secure a real chemical weapons threat, and earned the respect of some of NATO's finest special operations personnel. But more importantly, she had been reminded why she had chosen this career path in the first place. Working alongside other elite soldiers, even undercover, had given her a sense of camaraderie and shared purpose that her solo operations couldn't provide. The mockery at NATO camp had turned into mutual respect, but the real victory was the confirmation that excellence in military service came from capability and character rather than appearances or assumptions. For Sarah Martinez, call sign Apex, that lesson was worth more than any mission success. Sarah Martinez stepped off the military transport helicopter onto the dusty ground of the NATO training facility in Romania. The rotor blades whipped her dark hair across her face as she grabbed her gear bag and moved away from the landing zone. At 28 years old, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a lean build that made her look more like a college student than a seasoned military operative. The other trainees were already gathered near the main briefing tent, and Sarah could feel their eyes on her as she approached. Most of them were men, tall and broad-shouldered, with the confident swagger that came from years of military service. They wore the uniforms of various NATO countries: American Marines, British SAS, German KSK, and Canadian JTF-2. Sarah wore simple woodland camouflage with no visible rank or unit insignia. "Great, they sent us a desk jockey," muttered Sergeant First Class Mike Reynolds, a towering Marine from Texas. His comment drew snickers from several nearby soldiers. "This is supposed to be an elite joint operations course, not bring your daughter to work day." Sarah ignored the comment and found a spot near the back of the group. She had heard it all before. In her 12 years of military service, she had faced skepticism, harassment, and outright hostility from those who judge her based on appearance alone. What they didn't know was that Sarah had more combat experience than most of them combined. The briefing officer, Colonel James Harrison from the British Army, called for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Exercise Iron Eagle. Over the next 2 weeks, you will participate in the most challenging multinational training program NATO has to offer. You represent the best of your respective special operations units, and you're here to learn advanced tactics, share knowledge, and build international cooperation." Harrison's eyes swept across the assembled group. "This exercise will test every aspect of your training: combat skills, survival techniques, intelligence gathering, and teamwork under extreme pressure. Some of you may not complete the program. That's not a failure. It's a reality check." As the colonel continued his briefing, Sarah noticed the sideways glances and whispered comments from her fellow trainees. Lieutenant Hans Weber from the German KSK leaned over to his teammate. "What unit do you think she's from? Probably communications or intelligence analysis." Corporal James Mackenzie from the British SAS shook his head. "More likely she's here as an observer. Maybe writing a report on gender integration or something." The assumptions continued throughout the day as they were assigned to barracks and given their initial equipment check. Sarah bunked with 3 other soldiers in a small prefabricated building. Her roommates were polite but distant, clearly unsure what to make of her presence. That evening in the mess hall, the conversations grew louder and more pointed. Captain Antonio Silva from the Portuguese Special Operations Group decided to voice what many were thinking. "No offense, but I'm curious about the selection criteria for this exercise. I thought this was supposed to be for Tier 1 operators only." Sarah looked up from her meal tray. "What makes you think I'm not a Tier 1 operator?" The question hung in the air for a moment before Reynolds laughed. "Come on, sweetheart. Look around. Everyone here has been through hell to earn their spot. Rangers, SEALs, SAS, GIGN. What's your background? Supply chain management?" Sarah's expression remained calm, but her dark eyes hardened slightly. "I've been in the military for 12 years. I've served in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and several places that don't officially exist on any mission reports." Weber raised an eyebrow. "Doing what exactly? Running logistics?" Before Sarah could respond, Mackenzie jumped in. "Look, I'm sure you're good at whatever you do, but this exercise is designed for people who kick down doors and engage targets at close range. It's going to be physically and mentally brutal. Maybe you should consider if you're really prepared for what's coming. The mess hall had grown quiet, with other trainees listening to the conversation. Sarah stood up slowly, her meal barely touched. "I guess we'll find out tomorrow." As she walked away, Reynolds called after her. "Hey, no hard feelings. We're just looking out for team safety. Nothing personal." Sarah paused at the door, but didn't turn around. "Everything in the field is personal, Sergeant. Everything." Back in her bunk, Sarah lay awake listening to the sounds of the base settling in for the night. She thought about all the times she had faced similar skepticism, and how each time she had proven herself through actions rather than words. Tomorrow would be no different. What her fellow trainees didn't know was that Sarah Martinez had been recruited into a highly classified program while still in Army basic training. Her psychological profile had caught the attention of military intelligence recruiters who were looking for individuals with specific traits: high intelligence, emotional control under stress, and the ability to blend into any environment. For the past decade, Sarah had operated under various cover identities across the globe. She had infiltrated terrorist cells in the Middle East, gathered intelligence on arms dealers in Eastern Europe, and conducted solo missions that had prevented several major attacks on Western targets. Her official military record showed her as a signals intelligence analyst, but her real work was known only to a handful of people in the Pentagon. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same qualities that made her excellent at covert operations, her unassuming appearance and ability to be underestimated, were now working against her in this environment where reputation and physical intimidation often mattered more than actual capability. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah wondered how long it would take before her fellow trainees realized their mistake. In her experience, it usually didn't take very long.